My father collapsed before the lawyer could finish reading the DNA report. 1 second, Richard Morgan was sitting at the end of the conference table, wearing the same expensive navy blazer he wore to church and business meetings. The next, his hand slipped from the armrest, his face went gray, and he crumpled toward the carpet. My brother Ethan jumped up. My mother screamed. The lawyer froze with the report still open in front of him, and I just stood there in my army dress uniform staring at the man who had spent 31 years telling me I wasn't good enough to be his daughter. A few minutes earlier, Dad had smiled while his will was being read aloud. Everything goes to my son Ethan. My daughter gets nothing. He had paused just long enough to make sure everyone heard him. Then he looked directly at me. She was never really my daughter anyway. I had heard those words before. Not exactly those words, but close enough. This time, though, I had come prepared. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't argue over the house, the investment accounts, or the lake property Dad had promised Ethan for years. I simply placed a sealed envelope on the lawyer's desk. "You're right, Dad," I said quietly. "I'm not your daughter." His smile disappeared, but neither is he. That was the moment everything changed. My name is Claire Morgan, and until that afternoon I had spent most of my adult life trying to earn something I should never have had to earn in the first place, my father's respect. I grew up in a comfortable suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, in a house with a 2-car garage, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a family that looked perfectly normal from the outside. Inside our house, however, there was always a line between Ethan and me. Ethan was the son Dad wanted. I was the daughter he tolerated. If Ethan brought home a B, Dad told him he had done fine. If I brought home an A-, Dad asked why it wasn't an A. When Ethan totaled Dad's old pickup at 22, Dad helped him replace it. When I told Dad I had been accepted into a military officer program, he stared at me as if I'd announced I was joining a circus. "The Army," he said. "Yes." "You're actually serious?" I am. He shook his head. "That's not a career for a woman like you." I remember sitting across from him at the kitchen table, still wearing my college sweatshirt, trying to understand what he meant. "What kind of woman am I?" He didn't answer. He just pushed his coffee away and walked out. That was the first time I understood that my father wasn't disappointed in my choices. He was disappointed that I had choices he couldn't control. I joined the Army anyway. Over the years, I learned how to sleep in unfamiliar places, make decisions under pressure, carry responsibility without complaining, and keep my emotions steady when everyone around me was losing theirs. The Army gave me confidence, but it never erased the little girl inside me who still wanted her father to say, "I'm proud of you." I tried. I called home after promotions. I sent photographs. I mailed gifts. When Mom needed help paying a medical bill, I covered it. When Ethan fell behind on his truck payments, I quietly sent money to Mom so she could help him without Dad knowing. I never told anyone. I thought kindness might eventually soften my father. It didn't. When I returned home from my last deployment, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "You're finally done playing soldier." I smiled faintly. "Good to see you too, Dad." Ethan laughed from the living room. Dad joined him. I let it go. That was what I had learned to do. Let it go. But 3 months later, I received a call from David Harper, the family attorney. His voice was unusually careful. "Claire, your father wants you present for a meeting concerning his estate. Is he sick?" "No." "Then why me?" There was a pause. "I think you should come." So I drove to his office the following Thursday. I wore my Army dress uniform because I had come straight from a military event. I almost changed before entering the building, but something stopped me. Maybe I was tired of hiding who I had become. Inside the conference room, Dad sat beside Ethan. Mom was across from them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ethan looked pleased with himself. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. David had placed a thick folder on the table. "Before we begin," he said, "I want everyone to understand that this is simply a reading of Mr. Morgan's current will." I nodded. Dad finally looked at me. There was something cold in his expression. Not anger, certainty, as if he had been waiting years for this moment. David opened the document. The Morgan residence goes to Ethan. Ethan smiled. The lake property also goes to Ethan. Dad leaned back. The investment account's business interests and remaining personal assets are to be distributed according to the following provisions. David paused. Then he looked at me. Claire Morgan receives no inheritance under this will. Silence filled the room. I looked at my father. He smiled. Then came the sentence I knew I would never forget. She was never really my daughter anyway. For a moment, nobody moved. Mom looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Ethan's smile faded, and Dad leaned forward as though he expected me to beg. Maybe that was what he wanted. Maybe after all those years he still believed I would fight for scraps of approval. But I wasn't that little girl anymore. I had learned that silence could be stronger than shouting. I took one slow breath. Then I reached into my bag and placed the sealed envelope on the lawyer's desk. The envelope sat between us for several seconds. Nobody touched it. My father stared at it as if he already knew what was inside while Ethan kept glancing from the envelope to me. Finally, Dad gave a short, bitter laugh. What is this supposed to be? I looked at him. You'll find out. He leaned toward the lawyer. David, I don't know what game she's playing, but I want this meeting over. David didn't move. Mr. Morgan Claire has provided this document for the record. I think we should allow her to explain. Dad's jaw tightened. I watched his face and realized something strange. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of disappointing him. That realization had taken 31 years. I wish I could say it happened all at once, but it didn't. It started much earlier, long before the lawyer's office, long before the will, long before the DNA test. It started in a small kitchen in Ohio when I was 8 years old. Ethan had come home from school with a report card full of average grades. Dad opened it at dinner. Not bad, son. Ethan grinned. Then Dad looked at mine. Every subject was an A. He frowned. You're getting lazy in math. I remember staring at the paper. It's a 96. A 96 isn't 100. Ethan laughed. Dad laughed with him. I didn't. That became the pattern of my childhood. Ethan could make mistakes and still be the golden boy. I could do everything right and somehow still disappoint my father. When Ethan played baseball, Dad never missed a game. He bought him a new glove, paid for private coaching, and drove 2 hours for an out-of-state tournament. When I joined the high school track team, Dad said I should spend my time doing something more practical. When Ethan got his driver's license, Dad bought him an older pickup truck. When I got mine, Dad told me I could use Mom's car when she wasn't using it. I learned early not to ask for much. My mother tried to compensate for it. She would slip extra money into my backpack before school trips. She would leave little notes in my lunch. And whenever Dad wasn't listening, she'd say, "I'm proud of you, sweetheart." I treasured those words, but I still wanted to hear them from him. When I graduated from college, I invited my parents to the ceremony. Mom came. Dad left before the reception. He said he had work. I knew he didn't. That evening I found him sitting in the garage drinking coffee and looking through paperwork. I graduated today, I said. I know. Did you see the ceremony I was there? You left. He shrugged. Your mother likes those things. I stood there for a moment. Dad, I'm thinking about joining the army. He finally looked up. The army? Yes. Why? Because I want to serve. He laughed, not loudly. Just enough to make me feel foolish. You have a degree. You could get a real job. I swallowed. It is a real job. His expression hardened. Don't start arguing with me. I wasn't. You've always been stubborn. I remember looking at him and wondering whether there was anything I could ever do that would make him see me differently. I joined anyway. The day I left for training, Mom hugged me so tightly that I could barely breathe. Dad shook my hand. That was all. Take care of yourself, he said. No hug. No, I'm proud of you. Just 4 words that sounded like something you would say to a neighbor. Years passed. My career progressed. I earned promotions. I learned to lead soldiers older than me. I learned that leadership wasn't about being the loudest person in the room. It was about being the one others could trust when things went wrong. My commanding officers saw qualities in me that my father never seemed interested in seeing. At home, however, nothing changed. Ethan remained the favorite. He changed jobs repeatedly. He started a landscaping business that failed. He bought a truck he couldn't afford. He borrowed money from Dad, then borrowed more. Every time Dad found a reason to help him. "He's trying," Dad would say. I wanted to remind him that trying wasn't the same as taking responsibility. But I stayed quiet. When Mom needed surgery, I flew home and helped with everything. I arranged appointments. I drove her to the hospital. I handled the insurance paperwork. And when the bills arrived, I paid several of them myself. Dad never thanked me. Instead, he told relatives that Ethan had been taking care of the family. I didn't correct him. Maybe that was my mistake. I kept believing that if I was patient enough, eventually my father would understand. Then came the day I realized patience wasn't the same as surrender. I had returned home from deployment and was sitting at the kitchen table with Mom. She was sorting old photographs. One picture caught my attention. It showed her as a young woman standing beside a man I had never seen before. I picked it up. "Who is this?" Mom's hand stopped. For several seconds she said nothing. "Mom." She took the photograph from me. "Just someone I knew a long time ago. What was his name?" "Daniel." "Daniel who?" She looked toward the hallway. Then she lowered her voice. "Claire, some things are better left in the past." I didn't push her. But I remembered the photograph. And I remembered something else. My father had once told me when I was 17 that I had never looked much like the family. At the time, I thought it was just another insult. Now, sitting across from him in that lawyer's office, I wondered whether it had been something more. Dad tapped the envelope with one finger. "Claire," he said, "whatever you're trying to accomplish here, you're wasting everyone's time." I looked at him. "No, Dad." I rested my hand on the envelope. "For once, I'm not wasting anything." His eyes narrowed. I knew he still didn't understand. And maybe that was the only advantage I had ever had over him. He thought I was still the daughter who needed his approval. He didn't know that years of military service had taught me something he could never take away. Sometimes the strongest response isn't revenge. It's simply refusing to be afraid of the truth. And I was finally ready to let the truth speak for itself. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, just as I had countless times during my years in the Army. For most of my adult life, early mornings had meant preparation. Check the schedule, review the details, make sure nothing important had been overlooked. That morning, I did the same thing. Only this time, the mission was personal. I drove back to my parents' house in the same quiet neighborhood where I had grown up. The streets looked smaller than I remembered. The maple trees had grown taller. The house itself looked almost exactly the same. But I wasn't the same woman who had left it years ago. Mom was waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked exhausted. "You shouldn't have come back so soon," she said. "I need to ask you something." She lowered her eyes. "I know." I put my purse on the counter. "Who was Daniel?" Mom's face changed immediately. It wasn't surprise. It was fear. She sat down slowly. "I knew this day would come." "What day?" "The day you'd start asking questions." I pulled out the photograph I had seen several days earlier. "Is this him?" She stared at the picture. "Yes." "Who was he?" She folded her hands together. "Daniel Harper." The name meant nothing to me. Was he my father? Mom didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence told me enough. I sat across from her. "Mom, I need the truth." She wiped her eyes. "Your father knew." My stomach tightened. "Dad knew he knew before we were married." I stared at her. How Mom took a slow breath. "Because I told him." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Then I asked the question that had been sitting inside me for years. "Why did he marry you?" "Because he loved me." She paused. "At least I thought he did." "What happened to Daniel?" "He left." "Did he know about me?" "Yes." I looked away. Suddenly memories that had never made sense began falling into place. My dark hair, my brown eyes. The way Dad sometimes looked at me as though he were searching for someone else's face. The comments about how I wasn't really like the family. I had spent years believing those words were insults. Maybe they had been confessions disguised as cruelty. Did you ever tell Dad I wasn't his? He already knew? Then why did he stay? Mom looked down. Because he thought he could raise you as his own. I almost laughed. He didn't. No, she whispered. He didn't. That was the first time I heard my mother say it. Not defend him, not explain him. Just admit it. I asked about Ethan. Mom's expression changed again. Ethan is different. Why? She hesitated. Because Richard always believed Ethan was his son. Was he? She looked at me. I don't know. That answer stopped me cold. You don't know. I thought he was. Thought. She closed her eyes. Claire, there were things happening in my life back then that I'm not proud of. I stood up. I need to know. Mom shook her head. Please don't do this. I've spent my entire life being punished for something I didn't understand. My voice remained calm, but I could feel the anger underneath it. I deserved the truth. She didn't answer. So I left. I didn't confront Dad. Not yet. Instead, I started with records. My military career had taught me not to make accusations without evidence. I contacted the hospital where I had been born. After providing the required identification and documentation, I requested copies of the records available to me. Weeks passed. Then an envelope arrived. I opened it at my apartment. There was nothing dramatic about the paperwork. No flashing warning, no shocking headline. Just dates, names, signatures, and medical information. But one detail immediately caught my attention. The original record listed my mother's maiden name. The later amended document listed Richard Morgan as my father. That alone didn't prove anything. But there was something else. The amendment had been filed months after my birth. I stared at the date, then I searched through the old family documents Mom had given me years earlier. There was a photograph of me as a newborn. On the back, Dad had written, Claire, our little girl. Our little girl? I couldn't decide whether those words made me angry or sad. I wasn't angry because he wasn't my biological father. Biology wasn't the part that hurt. What hurt was knowing that he had chosen to make me feel unwanted for something I had never done. I scheduled a private DNA test. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't tell anyone in my unit. I waited. The results arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened the email alone. The report confirmed what I had feared. Richard Morgan was not my biological father. I sat motionless for several minutes. Then I noticed something else. The report provided information about genetic relatives. One name appeared repeatedly. Daniel Harper. My hands started shaking. Daniel wasn't just some random man from my mother's past. He was connected to me. He was my biological father. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For the first time, I knew where half of me came from. But there was still one question. Ethan. I couldn't stop thinking about the way Dad had treated us. He had always insisted Ethan was his son, his heir, his legacy, the child who carried the Morgan name. So I arranged another test. This time I needed certainty. When Ethan agreed to participate, I didn't tell him everything. I simply said I was trying to understand some family history. He laughed. Still digging into Dad's old stories, something like that. He shrugged. Fine. The second report arrived 9 days later. I opened it alone. I read the first line. Then I read it again. Ethan was not biologically related to Richard either. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. My father had spent decades telling me I wasn't really his daughter. He had spent those same decades treating Ethan as the one true Morgan. And neither of us was his biological child. But I wasn't finished. I ordered one final test through an accredited laboratory using samples collected according to the lab's procedures. I wanted evidence that no one could dismiss as an online ancestry estimate. The final report arrived 3 weeks before Dad's will reading appointment. I opened it at my kitchen table. The conclusion was unmistakable. Richard Morgan was not my biological father, and he was not Ethan's biological father. I printed the report. Then I placed it inside a sealed envelope. I knew exactly where I was going to take it. Back to David Harper's office. Back to the room where my father planned to humiliate me. Only this time, he would have no idea what was coming. For the first time since the DNA results arrived, I understood why my father had spent so much time telling me I wasn't really his daughter. It wasn't because he had discovered some secret about me. It was because he had known the truth about himself. He had known I wasn't his biological child, yet he had still chosen to make me feel like an outsider. What I didn't understand was Ethan. If Dad had always believed Ethan was his son, why had he treated him so differently? I needed answers before I confronted anyone. So I called my mother again. She answered on the second ring. "Claire, Mom. I know about Daniel." There was a long silence. "You took the test." "Yes, I was afraid you would." "I know he's my biological father," she sighed. "I wanted to tell you, when I don't know. That isn't an answer. I know." Her voice cracked. I was ashamed. I sat quietly at my kitchen table. "Mom, I'm not asking you to defend yourself. I'm asking you to tell me the truth." Another silence followed. Then she said, "There was more than Daniel." I closed my eyes. "What do you mean?" "Before I married your father, I made mistakes. More than one." "I didn't say anything." She continued. "Daniel was your father. I knew that much. But by the time Ethan was born, Daniel was gone." "Who was Ethan's father?" "I thought it was Richard." "You thought?" "Yes." Her voice became quieter. "Richard believed it too." That sentence stayed with me. "So Dad never knew?" "Not about Ethan." I looked at the DNA report sitting beside my coffee. Then why did Dad treat Ethan like he was perfect? Because Ethan was the son he believed was his. And I wasn't. "No," Mom began crying. "He knew you weren't biologically his before he married me." "But he said he didn't care." I stared out the window. "He cared. I know. He spent my whole childhood reminding me. I know." For once my mother didn't make excuses for him. She simply cried. I asked her about the years after Ethan was born. She told me that Richard had become obsessed with building a legacy. He wanted a son who would eventually take over his landscaping supply company. He wanted someone who shared his last name, his business interests, and his idea of what a Morgan man should be. Ethan became that person in his mind. I became something else. A reminder of a truth Richard had accepted but never truly forgiven. I asked Mom whether Richard had ever contacted Daniel. She hesitated. Once. When, about 10 years ago. That surprised me. Why, I don't know exactly. What happened? "Daniel contacted us first. He wanted to know how you were doing." My throat tightened. "What did Dad do? He told him to stay away from you?" "Did Daniel?" Mom looked down. "He respected your father's wishes." I felt something inside me break. My biological father had been somewhere in the world knowing I existed, and I had grown up believing my father simply didn't love me. I asked Mom for Daniel's contact information. She hesitated again. "I don't know where he is now." "But you knew." "Yes, Mom. I gave you his old address." She pulled a folded piece of paper from a drawer. "I drove there 2 days later. The house belonged to someone else. But the neighbor remembered Daniel. He moved to Pennsylvania years ago," she told me. "I think he remarried." I thanked her and returned to my car. I sat behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes. I didn't know whether I wanted to meet him. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe some questions were better left unanswered. But I had one more problem. Ethan. The DNA report had been clear. Richard wasn't his biological father. I called Ethan. He answered casually. "What's up? Can you meet me?" "Sure. Everything okay?" "No." We met at a quiet coffee shop near his office. I put the report on the table. He looked at it. "What is this?" "Your DNA results." His expression changed. "You actually did it." "Yes." He read the report. At first he laughed nervously, then he stopped. "That's impossible. I thought so too." He looked at me. "So Dad isn't your father?" No, and he's not mine. No, he stared at the table. For once, Ethan had nothing to say. I expected anger. Instead, he looked lost. What does this mean? It means biology doesn't change what happened. He rubbed his face. Dad always said I was his son. I know. He told me I was the only one who understood him. I looked at him. Did you believe him? Of course. His eyes became wet. I spent my whole life trying to be the son he wanted. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because suddenly we were sitting on opposite sides of the same wound. I had spent my life trying to prove I deserved to be loved. Ethan had spent his trying to prove he deserved to remain the favorite. Neither of us had understood that our father's approval came with conditions. I told Ethan about the will. His face tightened. He really left everything to me. Yes, he looked ashamed. I didn't ask for that, but you accepted it. He didn't argue. After a long silence, he said, "What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Are you going to challenge the will I might have the right to, depending on the circumstances?" But that's not why I brought the DNA report, then why I looked directly at him. Because Dad needs to understand that the person he treated as disposable spent her entire life being more loyal to this family than anyone realized. Ethan lowered his eyes. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "I remember when you paid my truck payment." I froze. What Mom told me years later. I shook my head. "I never wanted you to know." "I know." He looked at me. "You always covered for me." I didn't answer. He swallowed. "I don't know why." "Because you're my brother." The words came out before I could stop them, even after everything I meant them. Ethan nodded slowly. Neither of us knew what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back to my father's office as the daughter who had been summoned to receive her punishment. I was going back as a woman who finally understood the truth. The will was going to be read. My father was going to make his choice in front of witnesses. And then for the first time I was going to let him hear mine. When I walked back into David Harper's office that afternoon, I already knew how the meeting would end. What I didn't know was how much it would cost everyone in the room. Dad sat in the same leather chair as before. Ethan was beside him. Mom sat across the table looking smaller than I remembered. David had the will in front of him. My sealed DNA report was still in his possession. Dad looked at me and smirked. "You came back. I said I would. I thought you'd changed your mind, about what he leaned back, about embarrassing yourself." I didn't answer. David adjusted his glasses. "Richard, we should proceed." Dad nodded. "Go ahead." David began reading the final provisions of the will. The house would go to Ethan. The lake property would go to Ethan. The investment accounts would go to Ethan. The remaining shares in Dad's landscaping supply company would go to Ethan. There were small personal bequests to a few relatives. Nothing was left to me, not even the watch Dad had promised me when I was a child. When David finished, the room became silent. Ethan looked uncomfortable. Dad looked satisfied. Then he turned toward me. "You heard him?" I nodded. "You got nothing." I heard him. He smiled. "You spent your whole life thinking you were entitled to something because you were my daughter." He paused. "But you weren't." Mom closed her eyes. Dad continued. "I gave Ethan everything because he was my son." I looked at Ethan. He didn't smile this time. Dad pointed toward me. "She was never really part of this family." I could feel Ethan shift in his chair. "Dad," he said quietly. Richard ignored him. "You wanted honesty, Claire. Now you have it." I took a breath. "Yes." Then I reached for the envelope. Dad's expression changed. "What is that?" I placed it in front of David. "Something that belongs with the estate records." David opened the envelope. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second. His face became serious. Dad leaned forward. "What does it say?" David didn't answer immediately. He looked at me. "Claire, are you certain these are the final laboratory results?" "Yes." "Were the samples collected according to the laboratory's documented procedures?" "Yes." David nodded slowly. Then he turned the first page toward Richard. Mr. Morgan, this report indicates that you are not Claire's biological father. Dad stared at this page, then he laughed. It was a short, nervous sound. That doesn't prove anything. I said nothing. David continued. There is another report. Dad's eyes narrowed. Another David placed the second document beside the first. This report indicates that you are not Ethan's biological father either. The room went completely silent. Ethan looked at his father. Dad looked at Ethan. Then he looked back at David. No, his voice was barely audible. No, that's not possible. I watched him carefully. For the first time, the confidence disappeared from his face. He looked older, not powerful, not intimidating, just old. He pushed himself up from the chair. Who did this? I did. You? Yes. You had no right. I almost smiled. Dad, you just spent 10 minutes telling everyone I wasn't your daughter. He pointed at the reports. You forged these. No. You've always hated this family. No. You're trying to destroy my relationship with my son. I looked at Ethan. I didn't do that. Ethan finally spoke. Dad. Richard turned toward him. Don't. Dad. I saw the report. You don't understand. I understand enough. Richard's face hardened. You're my son. Ethan swallowed. Maybe. That one word seemed to hit Dad harder than anything I had said. He sat down again. I could hear my mother's quiet breathing. Then Dad looked at her. You knew Mom started crying. I knew about Claire. His face twisted. You knew I knew she wasn't biologically yours. You knew all these years? Yes. He stared at her, and Mom lowered her head. I didn't know. Dad's hands began to tremble. He looked at Ethan, then at me, then at the reports. Everything he had built his identity around seemed to be disappearing in front of him. I could have enjoyed it. For years I had imagined a moment when my father would finally understand what his cruelty had done. But sitting there watching him break, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Dad, I said. He looked at me. I didn't bring these reports here to hurt you. He gave a bitter laugh. Then why? Because you made my blood the reason I wasn't worthy of your love. He stared at me. You told me I wasn't really your daughter. My voice remained calm. You made that statement part of the final record of your life. He looked down. I wanted you to understand something. What that I never needed your blood to make me your daughter. His eyes filled with tears. But you spent my entire childhood making me feel like I needed to prove it. Nobody spoke. I continued. I was there when Mom was sick. I helped with the bills. I came home when you needed someone. I called, I wrote. I served this country. I tried to make you proud. Dad looked away. And what did you give me? He didn't answer. Nothing I said quietly. But I survived that. Ethan wiped his eyes. Dad looked at him. You're still my son. Ethan took a long breath. I don't know what that means anymore. Dad's face crumpled. That was the moment I realized this wasn't revenge anymore. It was truth. And truth doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it simply removes the lie you've been living under. David closed the folder. The estate itself still has to be handled according to the actual legal documents and applicable law. The DNA findings do not automatically rewrite the will. Dad looked at him. So what happens now? David answered carefully. That depends on what each of you chooses to do. I stood. Dad looked at me. Are you going to take everything from me? I shook my head. No. Then what do you want? I looked at him for a long moment. I wanted a father. His eyes filled completely. I just didn't realize until today that I had been waiting for something you didn't know how to give. I walked toward the door. Behind me I heard Ethan say quietly, Claire. I stopped. He stood. I want to talk to you. I nodded. Tomorrow. Then I walked out. For the first time, I wasn't leaving because my father had rejected me. I was leaving because I had finally chosen myself. The next morning, Ethan and I met at the same coffee shop where we had talked about the DNA results. He was already there when I arrived. 2 coffees sat on the table. "I didn't know what you drink anymore," he said. "Black coffee." He smiled faintly. Still. I sat down. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said, "I didn't sleep. Neither did I." He stared into his cup. "I keep thinking about what Dad said." "So do I. He really believed I was his son." "Yes." "And you?" I looked at him. He always knew I wasn't his biological daughter. Ethan shook his head. "I can't understand how he could treat you that way." "I stopped trying to understand him a long time ago." He looked down. "I owe you an apology." I didn't answer immediately. "For what? For laughing when Dad made those comments about you." I remembered. There had been so many times. Family dinners, Christmas mornings, birthday parties. Dad would make some cruel remark and Ethan would laugh because laughing was easier than standing up to him. "You were a kid too," I said. "I was 30 when some of that happened." I looked at him. He nodded. I should have known better. That was the first honest thing Ethan had ever said to me about our relationship. I accepted it. Not because it erased the past, but because I could hear the regret in his voice. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The lawyer began reviewing the estate documents. The house wasn't automatically mine because of the DNA results. Neither was the business. Nothing worked that way. There were contracts, beneficiary designations, property records, debts, and years of financial decisions that had to be examined. That was one of the first lessons I learned from the whole ordeal. Real life doesn't work like a television courtroom. A DNA test can reveal biological truth. It doesn't automatically rewrite every legal document. David explained everything carefully to all of us. Dad became increasingly quiet. For the first time, he couldn't solve problems by shouting, he couldn't make the truth disappear by declaring that someone was disloyal, and he couldn't use money to make Ethan stand beside him. Ethan surprised me. He told Dad he wouldn't accept anything that wasn't legally his. Dad stared at him. "You're turning against me." Ethan shook his head. "No, then what are you doing?" "Trying to stop becoming you." Dad looked wounded. Ethan continued. "You taught me that being your son meant getting whatever I wanted while Claire had to earn everything." He swallowed. "I don't want to live like that anymore." Mom eventually moved into a small apartment of her own. That decision wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming match, no police, no slammed doors. She simply told Dad that she needed a life where she wasn't constantly afraid of his anger. For years, she had believed leaving meant destroying the family. Now she understood that sometimes staying inside a broken family can destroy people too. I helped her move. As we carried boxes into her new apartment, she stopped beside me. "I am sorry," she said. I knew what she meant. "You don't have to apologize for everything." "Yes, I do." She looked at me. "I should have protected you." I hugged her. "You're protecting me now." She cried against my shoulder. That was enough. A month later, I went back to see Dad. He was sitting alone in the living room. The house looked different without Mom's photographs and decorations. Smaller. He looked up when I entered. "You came?" "Yes." He nodded toward the chair. "Sit." I sat across from him. For a while, we listened to the clock on the wall. Then he said I was cruel to you. I didn't correct him. I blamed you for something you didn't do. "Yes." He looked down at his hands. "I thought if I treated you like an outsider, I'd eventually stop thinking about it." "Did it work?" "No." Oh, his voice broke. "I thought it would make me stronger." I looked at him. "It didn't." "No." He wiped his eyes. "I was wrong." Those words were difficult to hear, not because they were painful, because I had waited so long for them. "Dad," I said, "I don't know if we can ever have the relationship I wanted." "I understand. But I don't hate you." He looked at me. "I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything, I paused. Just don't hurt people anymore. He nodded. That was our reconciliation, not a dramatic embrace, not an instant restoration of 30 years, just two people finally admitting what had happened. And somehow that felt more honest. Before I left, Dad asked me one question. Do you ever wish you had never found out? I thought about it. No, why? Because the truth hurt. I looked toward the photograph still hanging on the wall, but living a lie would have hurt longer. He nodded slowly. I stood and walked toward the door. Claire, I turned. I am proud of you. For a second I couldn't breathe. Those were the words I had wanted since I was 8 years old, but now that they finally came, they didn't have the power they once had. I smiled. Thank you. Then I left. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to set. I sat in my car and allowed myself to cry. Not because I was broken, because something inside me had finally been released. I used to think family was determined by blood. Then I thought it was determined by a last name. Then I thought it was determined by who inherited the house, the business, or the money. I was wrong about all of it. Family is built in the ordinary moments. A phone call when someone is sick. A hand on your shoulder when you're afraid. A meal shared after a long day. A person showing up when there is nothing in it for them. My father spent decades believing that biology determined who deserved his love. But I learned something very different. Blood can tell you where you came from. It cannot tell you who you are. A DNA report gave me an answer about my past. It didn't define my future. I am still Claire Morgan. I am still a soldier. I am still the woman who learned to stand straight when everything around her was falling apart. And I no longer need my father's approval to know my worth. If you've ever been treated as the unwanted child, the forgotten sibling, or the person who was never quite good enough, I hope you remember this. You don't have to spend your whole life proving that you deserve to belong. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't destroying the person who hurt you. It's becoming someone they can no longer control. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means putting the burden down and finally walking forward without carrying it. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to think about the people who showed up for you when they had nothing to gain. If someone comes to mind, maybe tell them you appreciate them while you still can. And if you believe family should be measured by love, loyalty, and character, not simply by blood, share this story with someone who might need to hear that message. Thank you for listening.